Welcome to today's Explainer. We're diving headfirst into an incredible piece of 90s nostalgia to unpack one of the most successful and, honestly, deeply confusing pieces of consumer electronics ever made, the Game Boy Color. Now, if you grew up with this thing, it probably felt like pure magic. But looking back at the actual source material and the history behind it, this handheld was going through a massive identity crisis from the literal second it hit store shelves. So, the big question we're unraveling today is whether this device was actually a true successor to the original 1989 Game Boy, or just a really sneaky hardware stopgap. I mean, were we looking at an entirely new generation of gaming? Or did Nintendo basically just slap a fresh coat of paint on a decade-old machine just so they could sell us Tetris all over again? To figure that out, we've got to understand the wild environment it was born into. Section 1. The 9-year wait. Surviving on 8-bit hardware. To really get why the Game Boy Color happened, we have to look back at its wildly successful but rapidly aging predecessor. Think about the massive gap between the original brick, released way back in 1989, and a true next-generation handheld, the Game Boy Advance, in 2001. That is a 9-year lifespan for the original hardware before the Color even came along. Sure, Nintendo updated the shell in '96 with the Game Boy Pocket, and even dropped a backlit Game Boy Light over in Japan in '98, but underneath the plastic, games were still being built for late '80s tech. By 1998, this thing was a complete dinosaur. Now, you're probably wondering, how on earth did they get away with this for so long? Well, while competitors like the Sega Game Gear and the Atari Lynx had these beautiful backlit color screens, they absolutely chewed through batteries. The original Game Boy crushed them all because 4 AA batteries gave you seemingly endless playtime. And, of course, it had the killer apps. You didn't care about specs. You bought a Game Boy to play Mario, Zelda, and above all, Tetris. Nintendo had a total monopoly on portable gaming, and nobody could touch them, even with way better tech. Section 2. A stopgap successor, the 1998 hardware refresh. By '98, Pokémon had sparked this massive resurgence in the system's popularity, and developers were getting super antsy. They were literally begging for more power. Nobody wanted to be stuck on '80s hardware anymore. So, while secretly working on a true successor behind closed doors, Nintendo rushed out a stopgap to tide everyone over. But the hardware itself? It was full of crazy contradictions. It ran on just 2 AA batteries, which was awesome, but they completely axed the iconic contrast dial, so you couldn't adjust the screen at all. And get this, the screen was still completely unlit. That's absolutely wild considering they just put a backlight in the Japan-only Game Boy Light earlier that exact same year. Oh, and they also threw in an IR blaster at the top, kind of like a TV remote, that went almost entirely unused except for swapping high scores in a handful of games. So here you have this brand new system promising a vibrant leap into the future of color gaming. But if the sun went down, you were completely out of luck. You can just picture bewildered parents in 1998 picking up this unlit, slightly toy-like device with its tiny rubbery buttons, squinting at the dark screen, and uttering, "What the fuck is this?" It was just a totally baffling piece of technology. Section 3. The cartridge confusion, gray, black, and clear. But hey, if you thought the hardware was a head-scratcher, the games themselves were an absolute masterclass in retail chaos. Consumers faced a massive headache because you had 3 completely different physical cartridge types sitting right next to each other on the exact same store shelf. First up, the original gray cartridges. Pop these into the new Game Boy Color and you'd get some faint, pre-programmed color palettes, like making the sky blue in Super Mario Land. Then you had the black cartridges. These were enhanced, meaning they worked perfectly in black and white on the old Game Boy, but popped in glorious full color on the new system. And finally, the clear, bulging cartridges. These were the true exclusives that actually used the upgraded processor and would only play on the new Game Boy Color hardware. But here's the kicker. The cardboard boxes these games came in did basically nothing to explain this. Shockingly, tons of boxes just slapped a generic Game Boy Color logo right on the front, whether it was a black cross-compatible cart or a clear exclusive one. So unless you specifically memorized the plastic shapes of the cartridges, you wouldn't really know what you bought until you jammed an exclusive game into your old 1989 brick and got a snarky error screen telling you it wouldn't work. Section 4. A bizarre game library, ports, pinballs, and masterpieces. All of this confusion bled directly into what Nintendo and third-party devs actually published during this brief 3-year window. You'd normally expect a brand new console to drop with a massive, groundbreaking launch title to show off the new tech, right? Not here. In North America, the Game Boy Color launched with cross-compatible ports of classics. I'm talking about Tetris DX, which was literally just Tetris again, but missing the iconic theme song, and Game & Watch Gallery 2, a compilation of ancient LCD games. It was hardly the jaw-dropping launch lineup you'd expect for the so-called next generation of handhelds. Now, over time, they absolutely did drop some phenomenal remakes. We got Link's Awakening DX, which added a whole new color-based dungeon, and Super Mario Bros. Deluxe, totally packed with extra modes. These games were incredible. But they came with a pretty huge compromise. The Game Boy Color screen was tiny, and the aspect ratio was super skinny. So playing a sprawling NES game like Mario on this crunched, zoomed-in screen meant you often literally couldn't see what was right in front of you. It was a total nightmare trying to react to enemies coming off screen. And the weirdness definitely didn't stop at compromised ports. The system quickly morphed into this wild playground for experimental ideas. Take Mario Tennis and Mario Golf. These weren't just simple sports games. They were full-blown RPGs where you played as kids trying to level up and defeat Mario. Then there was Kirby Tilt and Tumble, which had an actual accelerometer built right into the cartridge, letting you physically tilt the Game Boy to roll Kirby around. And eventually, franchises like Wario Land just started ditching cross-compatibility entirely to build robust, exclusive color experiences. The third-party support? Equally chaotic. The whiplash across this library is genuinely staggering. On one hand, you had developers cramming gritty, mature titles onto this brightly colored plastic toy. Games like Metal Gear Solid, Grand Theft Auto 2, and Resident Evil Gaiden. On the other hand, Nintendo was self-publishing obscure revivals like Bionic Commando, sitting on shelves right next to the most baffling licensed cash grabs imaginable, like The Little Mermaid 2 Pinball Frenzy. The whole library felt like a complete free-for-all where anyone could just throw anything at the wall to see what stuck. Yet despite all this utter chaos, the true heavyweights did eventually arrive to save the day, mostly right toward the end of the system's life. Capcom stepped up and delivered two interconnected masterpiece Zelda games, Oracle of Seasons and Oracle of Ages. And, of course, Pokémon returned. While Gold and Silver confusingly still worked on the old black and white Game Boy, Pokémon Crystal arrived as a true, clear cartridge exclusive and pretty much solidified this handheld's legendary status forever. Section 5. The final verdict, defining the undefinable. So after navigating the frustrating hardware quirks, the messy retail cartridge situation, and a totally chaotic game library, where does that actually leave us? Looking at the data, Nintendo barely supported the Game Boy Color with massive, fresh first-party titles built from the ground up. Because it was only the new kid in town for 3 short years before the vastly superior Game Boy Advance dropped in 2001, even Nintendo seemed hesitant to fully abandon their massive original Game Boy user base. Honestly, they treated the Color less like a new generation and more like a brief, colorful visitor. So, the big question remains, what exactly was this thing? Was it an entirely new platform that revolutionized how we played on the go? Or just a really expensive way to play a slightly zoomed-in version of Super Mario Bros. In color? Ultimately, the Game Boy Color lived in this messy gray area, or, well, a full-color area, I guess. It wasn't quite a brand new generation, but it was definitely way more than just a minor tweak. It was this weird, undefinable, but absolutely essential 3-year stopgap. It perfectly bridged the gap between the 1980s and the 2000s, acting as this bizarre playground that kept handheld gaming vibrant and alive, right when it easily could have stagnated. Which really leaves you wondering, in today's ultra-defined, highly scrutinized tech landscape, would gamers even tolerate a device that didn't seem to know what it was? Imagine a new console launching today with unlit screens, 3 confusing cartridge types, and a library absolutely stuffed with old ports and pinball games. There's no way, right? It's safe to say the Game Boy Color was a one-of-a-kind lightning strike in gaming history. Thanks for joining me on this explainer. I hope this helped clear up the colorful chaos of 1998, and I'll catch you all in the next one.